I have a lifelong fascination with Léon Bakst, the arts movement that he was a part of, which is called the World of Arts, and his theater design art, his graphic art, his ideas, and everything that Lena Bernstein is going to tell us about. Lena is a professor emerita of Russian and comparative literature at Franklin and Marshall College. She is the author of Gogol's last book and numerous articles on Russian art, literature, and culture. She recently curated an online exhibit on Magda Nachman for Moscow State Museum of Oriental Cultures and is preparing a Russian language version of Magda Nachman, An Artist in Exile. Magda Nachman, Художник в изгнании. And we will hope to do this talk in Russian as well, eventually once the book is out. Couple of words about Globus Books. If you're not familiar with us, this is a small independent bookstore that has been serving the San Francisco community from 1971. We mainly deal in Russian books and have an enormous collection, about 30,000 volumes of books on all topics possible and imaginable, including the arts, of course, but also literature, history, poetry, philosophy, culinary, a huge collection of children's books, Tamizdat, politics, you name it, we have it. From here, I am very happy to pass the word to Lena, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Zarina, for inviting me and for your kind introduction. Léon Bakst and his students at Zvantseva Art School in St. Petersburg. So Zarina asked me to talk about Bakst, and I'll take this opportunity to introduce my book as well. So I write about Léon Bakst and his school in this book, Magda Nachman, An Artist in Exile. Magda's biography gave me an opportunity to rediscover and to reintroduce a forgotten artist and her works. But not only that, I write about her time, about the fateful events of the first half of the 20th century at which she was present. She was in Russia during the revolutions of 1917 and the Civil War. She was in Germany when Hitler came to power. She was in India when India gained its independence. What a life. At some point, she wrote in a letter to a friend, "We are miraculously still alive." So a life full of hardships, poverty, and so on. And so when I was finishing my book, I thought something would happen when the time the book would be ready for publication, because she faced so many adversities that it should be transferred into the book about her. And something did happen, as we all know, and we're meeting on the Zoom now and not in person. So I'm not surprised that a book about her is coming out at this crisis time. And here is my book in a nutshell. Magda was born in 1889 in St. Petersburg. I follow her as she grows up, as she grew in the capital of the empire, graduated with high honors from one of the best high schools in the city, attended a very unusual art school, very special art school under the direction of Bakst. She left the school in 1913, became an independent painter, participated in noted exhibitions, and of course, if you know anything about Russian culture, it's the period of Silver Age, of Silver Age culture, so very lively and vibrant culture. But the life she had prepared herself for was violently disrupted in the revolutions of 1917 and the Civil War. She became a refugee from Moscow, where she moved a year before the revolution. And led a peripatetic existence in the Russian countryside. And this is another huge topic in my book, Culture in the Provinces During the Civil War. In 1920, Magda returned to Moscow, and she met her future husband, the noted Indian nationalist and anarchist MPT Acharya. Acharya came to Soviet Russia in search of ideological and financial support from the Bolsheviks for his struggle for Indian independence. But very soon he became disillusioned with the Bolsheviks and their methods and wanted to leave. It wasn't that easy. Magda married him in 1922. I believe these are marriage pictures, and on the cover of my book, a pair to this picture, to this photo. And in the fall of 1922, they left for Berlin. Magda painted her mother's portrait. It's a pastel portrait, and she took it to exile with her. Now the portrait is in London. Russian Berlin in the 1920s was a very special place, and yet another theme of my book. Magda's experience in Berlin was unusual for a refugee from Russia, for she mingled not only with Russian immigrants, but with the Indian immigrant community as well. She also became a part of Jewish community, German Jewish community, not Russian immigrant community. She was brought up as Lutheran. Her mother was German, but her father was Jewish. And Nachman is an outspokenly Jewish name. Of course, in Germany, maybe in this country, no one would know, but in Germany, they would know that it's a Jewish name. So that was another societies, in other communities she was part of. But with Hitler's accession to power, Acharya and Magda had to leave, and they flee. They had to flee. And the only place they could go was India, which was very unusual. It was very unusual for European refugees in between war years to go to India, because the British were very stingy with their visas. So Magda came to India, and here I discuss Indian political, social, and artistic themes. As Magda participated in the development of Indian contemporary modern art and became a noted and successful painter, really successful painter. She established herself there. And I'm just showing one of her Indian period pictures, and pay attention to these horses, and maybe we can talk about this later as well. As you can see, Magda spent her adult life on the run, so to speak, frequently in poverty, sometimes on the verge of starvation. Yet, even though physical survival at times was difficult, she remained an artist. Miraculously, as she said, she remained an artist, not only alive, but continued with her vocation. She acquired her artistic vision and determination to paint early in life at Léon Bakst Art Academy in St. Petersburg. This teacher played a pivotal role in Magda's artistic life. So today I will talk about him and his school. Most art lovers know the name of Bakst in connection with Diaghilev's Ballet, whose premieres included Scheherazade, a number of things, Petrushka, The Firebird, Daphnis and Chloe, The Rite of Spring, The Afternoon of a Faun. You probably heard about all these performances. Some of you might have seen Bakst's costume design for Václav Nijinsky in the latter ballet, The Afternoon of a Faun. produced by Diaghilev in Paris in 1912. Here it was featured on the outdoor, it's huge banner. We went there, it was a marvelous show. And of course, it's a signature design recognized by many, so they chose it for the banner for the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Bakst was the foremost among Diaghilev's set and costume designers, and his fame in the West rests almost entirely on those designs. And there are collections of the costumes, of course, in the West, not so many of them in Russia. But in Russia, he is almost famous as a founding member of the World of Art Association, which Zarina mentioned, a very influential group of artists who came together at the close of the 19th century to promote Russian art in the West. But for the most part, the main goal was to promote current artistic trends in Western Europe in Russia, to introduce West European currents in art in Russia. You have to understand that there were no modern art museums in Russia at that time, only private collections. So to see what was going on in Paris or anywhere else, in Jugendstil in Munich, was practically impossible, only for a few who were privileged to see private collections. So that was their idea, and exhibitions followed one after another, inviting artists from the West to come to Russia. So Bakst was a founding member of this association. And the association published a magazine beautifully produced in this style which they called style modern, which is a Russian equivalent of Art Nouveau or Jugendstil. And this cover is 1902, produced by Bakst. Cupola, it's like Secession in Vienna, or something very similar structure. Bakst was also known as an outstanding portraitist and draftsman. And here I combine his drawing with a portrait. I'll talk about this later in a second. But even the Russians probably do not know are not aware of his role as a teacher, even though many of his students attested to his greatness as a pedagogue. For example, Marc Chagall, Bakst's most famous student, wrote, I quote, "My fate was decided by the school of Bakst. Bakst changed my life. I shall never forget that man." And who knew that Marc Chagall was Bakst's student? Also an obscure fact. What then were Bakst's ideas about art education, and how did he employ those ideas in his teaching? At the beginning of the 20th century, art education in St. Petersburg was dominated by the conservative Imperial Art Academy. Imperial Academy of Arts, that's the title. Aside from the academy, there were numerous private schools in the capital, but most of them hired teachers from among academy's graduates who would perpetuate its conservative methodology. So later in 1926, this is how Magda's closest friend and fellow student Julia Obolenskaya wrote about Bakst. So this is a picture produced in Bakst's school, and again we can see what is from Bakst here, where Julia is going with colors and composition. So, but she left memoirs about the school and actually commemorating Bakst, devoted to Bakst specifically. So that's what she wrote about their education before they came. She and Magda came to school to study with Bakst. By that time, the Academy of Arts had lost its prestige, and the teachers who had been themselves trained in the academy dissuaded students from entering it. They brought the same haphazardness to their teaching that they had inherited from the academy. The instruction consisted in pointing out some particular errors in drawing and in supplying small recipes in painting, which were different from each teacher. Young people stumbled in the dark, despaired, and tried one school after another. Many felt that a new school was needed in St. Petersburg. Among them, Konstantin Somov, a prominent Petersburg artist. He urged his first cousin and close friend, Elizaveta Zvantseva, and here is Elizaveta Zvantseva, to move her school from Moscow, her Moscow school, which wasn't doing too well in Moscow for a number of reasons, to move it to Petersburg. Zvantseva was an art educator and herself an artist. She has a very interesting story too. She, like a number of European and American women artists, traveled to Paris to study art in the liberal atmosphere of Parisian studios. And she brought the new ideas about art and art education, to which she had been exposed, back to Russia. So she was a perfect person to run an art school. Somov also suggested that she invite as teachers his close friends and colleagues, Bakst and Mstislav Dobuzhinsky, both members of the World of Art Association. And so in 1906, Zvantseva's art school opened in St. Petersburg with Bakst and Dobuzhinsky as teachers and Bakst as an artistic director. Bakst, in fact, had long been thinking about how to reform art education, and he wrote extensively about that. He enthusiastically took on the artistic direction of the school. He believed that the European art had flourished from the 13th century to the end of the 18th century. It had been born out of common aspiration from apprentices to masters toward a common understanding of what constitutes true art. Each school building on the achievements of its forerunners. But true art had come to an end in the 19th century, and classical art had become ossified in the hands of academic epigones. So Bakst had a goal for developing, for creating a unified artistic school, and school in the sense, a group of people coming together with one ideology, right? Not like a academy. Zvantseva ran academy. He was building a school of artists for working, a school of artists for working together, a common vision that would underpin each individual artist's contribution. Again, I quote Julia Abalenskaya, paraphrasing their teacher. She called the atmosphere of common endeavor the Bakst created a breath of life. So that's what she writes. The subliminal mood was wonderful. To be never alone, not cut off from the whole, to be a part of the whole, to carry out one's task in common endeavor, to look at the world with such big eyes, the eyes of the whole school, and at the same time to remain oneself. Certainly in contrast to all other schools which were subjugated by their teacher or by an idea. All this created a solid foundation under our feet. Bakst saw in the common endeavor a way toward a truly modern Russian art, which at the moment, in his estimation, was in its infancy. He believed that contemporary artists should not look back for the past models. They needed to work out new ideals of beauty, as well as the forms in which those ideals could be expressed. Thus, copying old masters, the main academic teaching method, was forbidden in Bakst classes. Also, they knew art history very well. They went to Hermitage and saw old masters, and they knew about them and what they were about. But this epoch of old was finished for them. So there was no continuity and no looking back. Bakst believed that contemporary artists must develop afresh, and I'm pointing out the adjectives he uses. They will come in handy a little bit later down in my talk. Bakst believed that contemporary artists must develop a fresh, even naive, savage eye and begin to paint without preconceptions and restrictions, like children who have not yet been taught by the examples of the elders. Like primitive peoples who are unafraid of bright colors and primitive lines. Bakst's school aimed to develop such an unspoiled, naive vision. Again, Julia, in her memoirs, continued. Already in a month of instruction, namely under Bakst, our opened eyes saw keenly and clearly, and we walked as though in a daze from the surging joy of a new way of seeing. As a teacher, Bakst would generously share his own fascinations with his students, and he was a passionate person. The captivating quality of his instruction, noted by many of them, was drawn from his own passionate study of the art of ancient Greece and Egypt, that of Asia, in particular the Japanese command of line, and he was a superb draftsman. By the way, Somov would come to school under the guise of a different name, Mikhailov. Somov, an artist who suggested Zvantseva to open the school, would come to school as a student to learn to draw from Bakst. And many of his students are credited with excellent draftsmanship. For example, here is the next slide. This is a student of Bakst, Nikolai Tyrsa. And you can see how marvelously this portrait is drawn. Bakst also transferred his own desire to experiment with the mutual influence of colors, and we'll see what that leads to in a bit. When Magda and her friends arrived at the Zvantseva school in the fall of 1907, they at once noticed a painting by a fellow student, Nadezhda Lermontova. It was a female nude painted entirely in shades of green. The first shock that Magda experienced on seeing Lermontova's nude gave way to a desire to experiment, to put colors in conversation with each other, or even to provoke an argument, to do something with colors. They were very passionate about working with colors. This desire grew even stronger when Lermontova's painting was singled out by Bakst as the best among the students' summer efforts. Freedom in the use of color was achieved by the students only after a long struggle to produce compositions using just 2 or 3 colors, usually with broad brush strokes on very coarse canvas, a typical assignment, a typical Bakst assignment. And this is one of the results of this play with colors, Nikolai Tyrsa landscape. In class, Bakst would choose one student's work, assemble all the others around it, and critique without mincing words, pointing out all the shortcomings in tone and line, color relationships, composition, every imaginable detail, thus working out a common understanding of their goal. However, he suggested no general recipes. for no general recipes for how to overcome the problem with difficulties which were pointed out at the sessions. Solving the paintings artistic problems was left to the student. They had to come up with how to solve the problem. I just wanted you to show this other landscape by yet another student. You can compare this and this. Different colors, right? Different colors. But you can see that the attention is to the relationship among colors. In one assignment, the students had been instructed to paint a model who was lying partly on green fabric and partly on red. So Julia commented about that because she really had trouble producing a satisfactory study. And Bakst at some point announced that in her picture, it was not an argument among the colors, but an all-out brawl. So she struggled, and finally in a dream, she realized that the red and the green of the fabric should produce, should be reflected in the tones of the model's flesh. And in the morning, she applied this discovery to her study. That was the painting which Bakst chose for the students' show. And Julia's failure to produce a satisfactory painting and then her triumph in finding what he was looking for served as a lesson to the whole class. And unfortunately, Julia's painting is lost of that time, but I believe that this painting might have been produced at the same class after Julia successfully solved her problem. Julia remarked about the class. We were taken by the world of color, bright, resounding, contrasting, by the life of this color in its development. In its collisions with other colors, we were taken with the simple and important outlines of things and people. The teacher's remarks didn't spare anyone. Often, the small, quiet, and meek Magda, as Julia describes her, was under the teacher's fire. As with polite bemusement, he grilled her about her use of color. What is this? Hallucination? Cholera? Or even worse, plague? Another student described these sessions of direct criticism with loving warmth, and here I quote him. It is impossible to convey Bakst's wit. In his unusual kind manner, the entire truth would be spoken without delicacy, but also without even a shadow of rudeness or cheekiness. Sometimes his comments hit painfully, but somehow they were always fatherly and good-natured. Little by little, each student worked out an individual way of painting in the framework of the common vision that allowed freedom in the handling of color. So that's what Bakst wrote in the review for the students' show, which was mounted in 1910. I quote Bakst. I would say that in 4 years at school, thank you. I would say that in 4 years at school, a single work has been produced by a common hand in spite of the variety of styles arising from the natural individual characteristics of each student. This work has been perfected, being animated by a single motivation, by a single aim understood by all the students. I tried not so much to teach as to awaken a desire to search, at the same time sternly guarding the searching young eye from falsity and banality. So it was an active studying, right? They took part in their education very actively. Excuse me. Bakst himself was a student at his own school, and this is very interesting. During that time, the style of his portraits began slowly to change. His biographer writes, his drawing had become more economical and more general. The line acquired a particular plasticity and clarity. And I showed you two paintings. Bakst himself was learning from the Japanese masters, just as he insisted his students should do. In 1909, he stopped working in graphic arts, the practice of which was forbidden at the school. Something happened in his own oil painting that surprised even him. He wrote in a letter, quote, "I have climbed at last into the brightest range of tones. Perhaps this is a new phase that has come naturally," end of quote. In another letter, he repeats, "I am drowned in color. I don't want to hear about graphic arts." Thus, did Bakst noted Bakst noted in himself the developments he had been encouraging in his students. And you can see he is drowned in color here. It's a marvelous set design for Helen of Troy, I believe. No, Helen of Sparta. Bakst's own enthusiasm for art was contagious. His demand that his students work 6 hours a day and produce a daily study in summer was carried out without question. Such sustained work had become for many of them an essential ingredient of their lives. For example, here is an excerpt from Magda's letter to Julia. She wrote it already later when Bakst left in 1911. "Today I finished my first summer study. I feel that the path will be right. To paint and to live are one and the same, as much as form and content are one and the same." So in 1910, Bakst considers his students ready for a public exhibition. The show opened on April 20th by the end of the season in 1910. In the spirit of collectivism, the students did not sign their paintings, which were identified only by numbers. However, we know about who did what, because Magda made this sketch. Even from this meager caricature, you can see that the students were taken. Their main goal was relationship of colors. Here is Magda's painting, caricatured herself. This is Magda and two art critics looking at the pictures. I have to show you Chagall's pictures. You probably can recognize them because he was Chagall from the very beginning. These pictures are lost and known only from this caricature. So this is Chagall and this is Chagall. Two paintings. The names are written here, but in new orthography after post-revolutionary orthography. So someone added these names post factum. There were no names on the sketch. Responding to various reviews of the exhibition, Julia noted, "It occurs to no one that under Bakst's guidance, the young people had been brought up on principles that were completely contrary to the foundations of world of art. Its retrospectivism contrasted to the naive savage eye, its stylization to the immediacy of a child's drawing, its graphicality to a wild, bright porridge of paint, and finally, its individualism to a conscious collectivism. You probably hear the repetition of the same adjectives: savage, naive, childish, which is very important for their vision of what they were doing. After one has read Julia's description of the principles and aspirations that Bakst's teaching had instilled in his students, it is natural to ask why they kept their distance from such Russian modernist groups as the Futurists, probably much better known in the West. And there were other groups like Jack of Diamonds and Donkey's Tale, and these were very fluid groupings. They penetrated each other, and we can call them futurists just for simplicity. But they all became vocal in the 1910s. Well, why were they distancing themselves? After all, Bakst had encouraged his students to be, I quote, daring, simple, rude, primitive. The art of the future demands a lapidary style because it cannot stand the exquisite. It is fed up with it. We can compare these words with any number of avant-garde art manifestos and pronouncements. For example, this is a description of the 1912 exhibition of the group Donkey's Tale. So that's how one person, a poet, describes this exhibition, and I'll show you some pictures later. Everything has become mixed up in the maddening whirlwind of the anatomized solar spectrum, in the primordial chaos of colors, which restored to the human eye a savage acuity of vision. This word savage repeats itself all the time. These words are almost the same as Julia's. They call for return to the freedom of color and to an unspoiled, raw, primitive vision. But the vision that Bakst imparted to his students was very different from the credo of the more assertive avatars of the Russian avant-garde. Perhaps his biggest quarrel was with the non-representational art that, in his view, disdained the natural world. Nor had he any sympathy with the images of herrings and pigs that had come down from shop signboards onto the futurist canvases and newspaper pieces superimposed on defaced Mona Lisa. Here is a painting, to my mind, a brilliant painting, which Bakst would disparage, of Natalia Goncharova, herself an artist, very interesting artist, but as you can see, there are pieces of newspaper and something else in this picture. Moreover, Bakst, always elegantly dressed, with refined manners, impeccable French, could not approve the happenings staged by the futurists. With their painted faces, masks, provocative dress, this is how Natalia Goncharova gave a talk after their exhibition in 1912, with her face painted this way. Bakst insisted that the goals of art should be much loftier than merely to shock the public. Nor did he believe in the call for a cataclysmic destruction of the old in order that a new path might be found, which in his eyes was a crude desire for self-assertion that had nothing to do with artistic integrity. Although he advocated a clear break with the tradition, he did not see a clean slate as a precondition for new growth. His students responded to their teacher's challenge, and the artistic convictions worked out in Bakst's classes remained with them for life. They rejected the excessive refinement of world of art style and detested the experiments of the futurists, in which they saw disdain for nature and pale imitation of Western models. In contrast to their earnest search for organic art. The differences between Bakst students and the futurists outlined above came to head during the art exhibition called 1915, which took place in Moscow in that year. It was organized by Konstantin Kandaurov, and this is a portrait by Valenskaya. Kandaurov planned to display the works of artists representing the diverse current trends in Russia, in Russian art, including futurists, knowing, however, that there were pranksters and provocateurs among them. Kandaurov made a particular effort to enforce decorum. But he miscalculated. He had not understood that the extent to which their pranks were an integral part of their art. They really developed the art of happenings or performance art, which became known only later, but they were practicing it. This is how one of the art critics describes the beginning of this exhibition. It's a rather long paragraph, but I think you'll enjoy it. And it's also mouthful of Russian names, but some of them might be familiar. Okay, so this is a part of a letter. There are again several shows in Moscow. I'd better tell you what is going on at Kandaurov's exhibition. It's called 1915. This is how it was. Larionov, I showed you a portrait of Goncharova done by Larionov. Larionov suggested they should organize a prank because no one needs pictures anymore. When they gathered the next day, they saw that Larionov had painted his self-portrait. The work was done directly on the wall. Because there was a fan on the wall, it became a part of the composition. Aside from the fan, Larionov glued pieces of cardboard from a hat box, fragments of a map, stretched some ropes and wrapped strips of cardboard, and so on. Those taking part gasped when they saw it. Of course, not with indignation, but with awe over the originality of the contrivance. It became clear to all that the public would talk only about Larionov. Then they decided somehow to minimize his originality. And so Lentulov hauled a shirt, a galosh, and a piece of soap, hung it all on the wall, daubed something around it, and called it a portrait. Mayakovsky provided his self-portrait. He glued half of his top hat, a glove, a book of poetry, a deck of cards, fragments of the newspaper, the Russian Word, and painted the gaps between these things. Malevich and Morgunov displayed their coat of arms because their pictures are in Petrograd. There is something daubed on the coat of arms, and a real spoon is attached. Under the coat of arms, there is a caption: "We are Februarists, since on such and such day of February, we became free of reason." With those creations, Larionov's prank was vanquished. Vasya Kamensky thought up the most original one. He brought a mouse trap with a live mouse, a frying pan, and a mortar, or it seems like it, and something else from the kitchen. And end of quote. Kamensky called his exhibit movable exhibit, with his mousetrap going around the exhibition. Well, when Nadezhda Lermontova read reviews describing the antics of the artists who had been invited to exhibit along the Zvantseva group, she sent an angry telegram to Kandaurov. That's what she wrote. "I consider the presence of the futurists an absurdity. I ask that measures be taken to separate me and like-minded exhibitors or return my works. A letter will follow." The letter that followed was no less angry. Even Magda, sensitive, considerate, the last person to wish to offend anyone, could not condone the futurist presence, and also wrote a letter to Kandorov saying that it's impossible for her to exhibit under the same roof with the futurists. So Lermontov's and Magda's letters echoed Bakst's view on art. But the two women looked at the futurist performances with horror and disgust and considered them aesthetically and ethically unacceptable. In conclusion, I'd like to show you 3 pictures from the exhibition, and maybe that would be a good point for discussion. So the first picture is Vladimir Mayakovsky, as you can see, non-representational, savage colors. The second is Kazimir Malevich with Mona Lisa, defaced. And the third at the same exhibition is Chagall. So, well, for us nowadays, we look at these pictures, we know that they're from the same era, right? But you can see how belligerent the groups were, how they had to stake their ground and what they were doing without mincing words, as Bakst did. So I'll finish here and take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena. That was fascinating. Thank you very much. So
I often don't hear much about artists who are famous as teachers. And I found myself thinking of the American artist Robert Henry, who was his teacher in Philadelphia. And I wonder if others had made a connection between these two people.
I wouldn't know.
Not a similar artist visually, but very similar in having created this passionate environment with the students. And being remembered almost entirely as a teacher as much as an artist.
I vaguely heard about this person because someone I know is connected to Philadelphia School of but I don't know any details, whether there is a connection. Bakst had been in this country twice, I believe, but both times in Baltimore, in Evergreen Estate, where he built a theater with sets. And there are a number of his paintings in this estate, which is now a museum which belongs to the Johns Hopkins University. He had a patroness there, but I don't think he traveled and knew American artists at the time.
Yeah, also, I want to barge in and say that actually this is quite unusual to hear about Bakst as a teacher. He's mainly known for his theater designs, for his fashion design, for his decorative art, illustrations, and the list goes on. So it was, I have to say, almost new to me to learn as much in detail. I knew about Marc Chagall, but I never really had this richness of details, and it was fascinating to hear his approach and the richness of atmosphere that, of course, existed at the time. And this is the stage in time and the stage in Russian art history that fascinates me, because it was bursting with life and creation. And I was lucky enough to read some parts of Lena's wonderful book, which I highly recommend. And I'm, well, it's debatable whether I'm an expert on the subject, but I sure read a lot about this time and about Bakst and about the schools of arts in St. Petersburg at the time. But I found all these details. And one thing that I didn't realize, that there was this famous tower of, it was called the Tower of Poetry, of a very famous symbolist poet, that was located just one floor above the Academy of Arts, so the student could roam from Bakst, the Buzinski, and the Miroskustniki, the world of art movement teachers, like one step up, and there with symbolists and imaginists, and it's just unbelievable. I'm so jealous. If I were to be given a chance, I'd give anything to travel back in time, although, of course, one would want to travel back because right after that, the First World War happened and then the revolution, and they paid for it. But the richness was there. So I highly recommend this book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Actually, the Buzinski, in his memoirs, writes that the students were educated not only in art, they got a very broad general education, and the connection with the tower above them was a real connection. So the poets would come to their classes, and they were invited to come up. So in later memories about Magda, I always see how people are amazed at how educated she was, how much she knew in poetry and history and art history. And it was due to this incredible environment they were living.
Fascinating. And they spoke many languages. And one aspect that strikes me is there are many aspects that strike me as modern and relating to our times. And one of them is we often don't realize how advanced and educated the women at the time were. The fact that the woman ran the academy, and she wasn't the only one. A lot of women, as you note in your book, come back from Paris and open their academies of arts and art studios, and all the experimentation, say Goncharova with her makeup, or Lermontova, or they have the freedom to explore, and they're this, at least it's seemingly they enjoy the equality, which even these days sometimes is questionable, especially in some places. Yeah. So it is really interesting to see what actually existed and what they were able to create due to these freedoms that they had.
Yeah, actually, Zvantseva was a part of a larger movement, of course. There was a wonderful exhibition in the Clark Art Institute a couple of years ago, women artists in Paris, 1850, 1900s. And the exhibition, well, Zvantseva was one of those women who went to Paris to study, and then all of them, most of them, came back to their home countries and became art educators, and were especially active in women's education. So Zvantseva just was part of this international movement. And yes, you're right. The freedom is amazing. We don't think about these possibilities.
All this turmoil happens right after this moment. So what happened to all the paintings? What happened to the works that were at that exhibit? And did Magda ever go back to Russia?
She never went, no. It's very sad. It's really very sad, because I looked and looked and looked, and the majority of pictures I found were in India. But in Russia, and it's not true only for Magda, it's true for the whole school, actually. Chagall was very lucky that Malevich ousted him from Vitebsk. I don't know whether you know the story. So Chagall, after the revolution in 1918, he came back to Vitebsk, his place of birth, right? He was born there, and established an art school and invited L. Lisitsky, his friend, and Lisitsky invited Malevich there. And it was a jolly good time for a while. They were painting houses and fences, their students, the whole town was painted. But then you can see in the pictures I show you the clash between Malevich and Chagall. Yeah, it's in their painting. You can see this. They take and learn from each other, of course. And in Chagall, you can see Cubist elements but they couldn't stay together in Vitebsk. It was too small. And Chagall had to leave. And because he left, he came to Moscow and worked for the Jewish theater for a while. And then he and Bella left for Paris, which was very lucky. So we know who Chagall is. Had he stayed in Russia, who knows? Probably not, because Chagall's exhibitions were mounted only recently. No one heard of Chagall in my childhood, certainly not. And most of these people from Bakst school, like Tyrsa I showed you, like Ivanov, the picture I showed, marvelous artist, marvelous, just excellent artist. A few pictures left, disappeared. A new book is coming out in the fall in Moscow. I just reviewed it, about Ivanov. Disappeared. Lermontova, a very talented artist, and Bakst, she was the teacher, the student of Bakst, just worshipped him, and was ready for a personal exhibition long ago, right? She died in 1921, and 2 years ago, her exhibition was mounted. First exhibition was mounted, and the pictures which were found here and there, not many. Many perished in Leningrad during siege, burned, who knows, disappeared. I can tell story after story if you want. There is a wonderful story about Julia, who was also a very strong artist and graphic artist too, and book designer. So in 1948, her pictures, a bunch of them, were given to a restoration institute for practicing new chemicals using her papers. So someone just saw those pictures and decided, we'll put it in a drawer and see what happens. Well, 3 years ago, they discovered those, I was there in 2016. They discovered those pictures, restored them, and there was a big exhibition. She died in 1945, yeah? And this is the first exhibition which happened quite by chance, yeah? So it's tragic. It's tragic. There was another student in Bakst school, Shekhid, on all accounts, very, very talented, on par with Chagall. And he did leave, but he disappeared in Holocaust, and all his pictures disappeared. So, miraculously alive, miraculously alive.
Well, it sounds that it is a Russian roulette style. Yes. The art preservation of the worldwide. In the beginning of the past century, everybody heard of Bakst, especially in Paris, London, Rome, in Europe, and in New York, where he did receive the orders for his patterns for the commercially produced fabric and so. But in Paris, the whole beau monde was following his fashion of his design and Scheherazade. Everybody was wearing the sharovars, the pants that he designed for Scheherazade and so forth. And the colors of the green and purple and orange were everywhere. So he was a huge presence. And yet in Russia, he was still just a Jew. He was not allowed to live in the Pale of Settlement. And again, for those who are not aware of the situation, in the Russian Empire at the time, only a certain percentage of Jewish people by religion were allowed to live in big cities. And there were certain conditions under which they qualified. So while Bakst was married to a Christian, he qualified to be living there. And once he divorced her and he converted back to Judaism, he did not have the right to be in St. Petersburg. But my question to you, I just got really curious, Lena. When he was a student of the Imperial Academy of Arts, he wasn't married to Lyubov Tretьякova yet. How did he make it to St. Petersburg?
Well, he was allowed to stay not only because he was married to her. First of all, there were reforms of Alexander II. Yeah, when Bakst was kicked out of Russia in 1912, the times were very different. Yeah, at the end of the not at the end, at the very end, things were different too. But he could study as a student. He came as a student and he could study. Besides, his grandfather was a supplier of fabric for soldiers' coats to the court, right? So he had, he was from Grodno, right, from the Pale, but he had a permission to study, and he came and studied there, and then he stayed.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I believe partly he was kicked out because, as Alexandre Benoit said, he was a patriot of Judaism. He wasn't a believer at all. He hardly knew what it was all about. Well, I take it back. He probably knew, but he didn't practice Judaism by no means. But he felt his necessity to convert to Lutheran faith in order to marry Lyubov Tretьякova as affront and injury. And as people report, his friends report, he really suffered greatly because he had to do that. And as soon as he divorced, he turned back to Judaism, although he was not a practicing Jew. And because he turned back to Judaism, here they got him, right? He wasn't allowed to stay. What is interesting with this paucity of what remained, exhibition after exhibition now are mounted in Moscow, especially by Andrei Sarabyanov, who goes in the provinces, finds. So this picture was painted in 1916, was bought by an art collector, and then in 1920 it was exhibited in Kazan. Kazan is the center of Tatarstan. It's due east from Moscow. And it stayed there in the Kazan Art Museum. In 1948, when the struggle with formalists started in Russia, this picture was ordered to be destroyed, just took out and ordered to be destroyed. And one of the curators hid it in a closet, just rolled it up and hid it in a closet. And after a while, when she was very ill, a new young curator came who was interested in modern art and was kicked out of the museum, by the way, very soon for being interested in the wrong things. And she confided to him and gave him this picture. They both were risking big time, especially this woman. You know, to do this under Stalin, when you were ordered to destroy the picture, was not comme il faut and was not safe. But they did it. And in 1991, when things became easier, this picture was returned to Kazan Museum, and now it's in Kazan. It was exhibited in the Russian Museum in 2016 at the exhibition of Petrov-Vodkin students, which actually opened with Bakst students, because Petrov-Vodkin came in, when Bakst left, he came. And in this picture, of course, you can see influence of Petrov-Vodkin. I especially love this part of the picture, this folds of fabric and how the fabric falls here. And you can see what an excellent draftsman she is. Yeah, all the lines here, you just can follow with one swoop everywhere. And that's Bakst, of course. This, I read reviews, I never could find the original. Were terrific reviews of this. And this woman I know, she's elderly now, Maya. She lives in Washington. And I think it's a terrific portrait. And this is a drawing, you know, Bakst said, never take off your chalk or pencil off the line, make it with one swoop, go from head to toe. And that's what you can see here. This is from a catalog. This is a place where she lived in India. Unfortunately, it's black and white, but you can see how drenched it is with sun. Yeah, this white, and you know, I've seen places like this there in India.
What a treat. That's marvelous. I also found fascinating that she painted the only oil portrait of Marina Tsvetaeva, one of the probably biggest poets of the last century, and there are no oil portraits of her except for by Magda.
There are oil portraits, but made not in her lifetime. Yeah, it was from life in Koktebel.
Yeah,
she painted it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also a story. It's a storied woman.
There's actually one more question coming from the YouTube. So let me read it to you. Can you give a short summary of Magda's life in India? You also mentioned the horses in the Burmese women painting, as you may have had a comment on that. Curious what that would be.
Oh, you know, when I saw this, maybe it's long stretched, but I saw Petrov-Vodkin, and it's like mocking Petrov-Vodkin's most famous picture, Kupanie Krasного Konya. How would you translate the bathing of the red horse? Probably not horse, stallion.
Stallion.
Yeah.
Stallion.
So it's like mocking a little bit these horses, which are not heroic at all, but the men who are riding them have red loin cloth. Just so. But in India, again, Magda always found herself in a difficult situation. So in India, she was married to an Indian. So for the European community, although the community was small, she was on the fringes. She was married to a native. It wasn't done. For the Indians, she was a European. She was not quite of them. Yeah, she was a foreigner. So that was difficult. Nevertheless, she had wonderful friends, Indian friends, and they wrote about her in her obituaries with such warmth and such detail that just amazing to read. So she came there in 1936 after a long struggle by Acharya, by her husband, to acquire British passports, because he was persona non grata. He left in 2008 under orders for arrest for his freedom fighting. Yeah, he was a very active nationalist and well-known, actually, nationalist. So they couldn't go back easily. But they managed. He first came and then she came. And she became a member of the Bombay Art Society almost immediately after she came. Well, there are some reasons, probably someone helped them because they were very poor. In India, when I met people who knew them, a few, everyone said, oh, he was a communist. Oh, they were very poor. That was refrain, yeah, like leitmotif. He was a communist, he wasn't a communist. And they were very poor. Yes, they were very poor. But somehow someone helped them, and she became a member of the Bombay Art Society and began exhibiting very, very soon after her arrival, and exhibited a lot in group exhibitions, in solo exhibitions throughout her life in India. She also became a teacher, a mentor to the young modern artists. They were quite different. They were much more aggressive. She was rather conservative, as you've seen. Nevertheless, she always exhibited with them, and in obituaries you can see that what a huge loss it was for them when she died. She had a very peculiar experience in applying to be presented in a very important Indian exhibition in Burlington House in London in 1947. But she was refused on the grounds of being non-Indian and receiving European education, which gave grounds for a prominent scientist, Homi Bhabha. He was the founder of the nuclear program and a very outspoken socially and politically person who stood for Magda and used her case for determining who is Indian, because who is Indian? It's a country of many ethnical groups and backgrounds and mixed parenthoods, and most of their artists had European education. So who is an Indian artist? And Magda gave ground for this huge discussion which took place around her case. And actually, when she was denied participation in this show in London, she had a solo show in a very important place in Bombay at the same time. Yeah, but she died in 2 hours before the opening of her exhibition in 1951. Yeah, the exhibition was organized because she had a stroke and she was in a hospital for the poor, and they organized exhibition to collect money for her cure. But she died 2 hours, and it was like posthumous opening, and they sold almost everything. Someone wrote, Bombay never had such a gathering it saw at this exhibition. So miracles work, but not always.
Well, thank you so much, Lena. That was enlightening. And I want to finish one of the stories just to give the American audience, again, the idea, or people who have not heard of Bakst before and his teachings. I want to give you a very short story that actually happened to me. I was interviewing the cast of the punk cult film Liquid Sky, made in the 80s in New York. And I didn't realize that the crew was actually Russian immigrants, Russian Jewish immigrants. And so when I got to interview the arts director and the artist, I asked her a question. You use the colors of Bakst. You use the purple, green, orange. There, anyone who knows Bakst is immediately recognizable. Is there any connection? Were you influenced? And she said, oh yes, I grew up in Gulag because her parents were sent there by the Stalin regime. And so her arts teacher was another person in prison in Gulag who was actually captured by the Soviet troops in Paris, in France, after the World War II. And he fled the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1918 and worked for the Diaghilev Ballet, and obviously got the colors from Bakst. And so they traveled all the way from Paris, from St. Petersburg to Paris, to Gulag, from Gulag to New York. And then now this artist is a very successful art director and illustrator. She works in Hollywood. So this tradition goes all the way, and sometimes we don't recognize it, we don't realize it, and it's there. And it's so fascinating to uncover it and do this archaeology and find the connection, which I think your book is, so thank you for that. And we will have the book available at Globus Books in English for now, eventually in Russian. So I invite you to explore it more in depth. And thank you very much for everyone who listened to us. And thank you, Lena, for such a brilliant talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank
Bye-bye.